We are recording. There we go. Right, hello, my name is Jenny Barrett and I'm a film and history scholar and an enthusiast of folk tales and folklore, as well as a writer. Welcome today to Neil Phillip, the accomplished and highly esteemed folklorist, author and poet, author of the recently published Watkins Book of English Folk Tales. Neil's book was first published in 1992 with Penguin. It's a collection of over 100 carefully selected renditions of folk tales that have been meticulously researched by Neil, and it will be a genuine treasure on the shelf for listeners to the podcast. So welcome to the Folklore Podcast, Neil.
Hello, Jenny. Well, thank you for having me.
It's wonderful. Thank you. What I found really interesting right at the very beginning was that we have a foreword from Neil Gaiman there. And I just want to mention that for a moment before we start to talk about the collection itself and some of your inspiration there. He writes, "I read the Snow White story with 3 robbers instead of 7 dwarfs, and it changed the inside of my head," which I think is a wonderful way of describing the effect that some of these tales can actually have on the reader, or maybe we should say the listener, because you go to great pains to remind us that a lot of these tales originate in an oral storytelling tradition. It literally changes the way that we see stories that we already thought that we knew. So can you tell us why do we need this book? Why reissue it right now?
Well, I was always a bit disappointed that the book, when it was first published, did really sort of fell into a void. And I put so much work and effort and thought and care into it. I really put my heart and soul into it. And so I'd begun to think, well, maybe, as the rights are reverted to me, maybe I should republish it myself in some way. And I mentioned this to a friend who's a sort of freelance editor, Simon Spanton, and he said, "Oh, I think Watkins would be interested in that." And so I sent a copy to Fiona Robertson, the publisher at Watkins, and she leapt on it with glee. And so that's purely serendipity. But I think the book is getting so much very kind attention and acclaim that I think it is sort of hitting the zeitgeist in a way. And certainly there's a lot more interest in being paid at the moment to folk tales and the way folk tales intertwine with landscape. I think it's partly to do with this reinvigoration of people's sense of the land being a storied environment, that you've suddenly got a lot of writers drawing their inspiration from folk tales and folk songs. And so I think it's just hit its moment, which is very nice for me.
Yes, I think you're right. It's making me think of Edward Parnell's book very recently that he's brought out, where he's very much inspired by the landscape at I think again that Northeast, particularly, that he found himself drawn back to from visits as a child.
Yeah, no, that's a very, very good book. There's been quite a few like it, or sort of similar to it, coming out, like Caroline Larrington's Land of the Green Man is another one. I think that's, it's all to the good, really.
Fantastic. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that, about your inspiration, about why folk tales are so important. But let's talk a little bit about what we find within the collection. We've got many very well-known tales here. We've got Jack and the Beanstalk, we've got Cinderella, and a certain generation of Brits and plenty of others too will have first encountered these stories when they were learning to read. Many, I would hazard a guess, in Ladybird books, for example. So
yes.
What do you think these versions contribute to these well-loved tales that we feel like we've already known?
I wanted to show the range of voices that you find in the recorded tradition of English folk tales, and the range of registers of voice as well. And I think one of the things that I'm interested in about folk tales in general is that they weren't seen as particularly as children's stories. I mean, there are English folk tales which were seen particularly as stories for children, and they're mostly really macabre and frightening. And but something like Jack and the Beanstalk was not particularly. You know, these were adult entertainments, um, and this is true of all wonder tales. You know, of the Grimm's tales as well. And it's really been a slow process of attrition that these tales, which are full of murder and incest and all kinds of awful things, have suddenly come to be regarded as suitable only for children. And it's simply not the case.
It's a sort of a Disneyfying effect, isn't it? That we
It
see some of
is,
these
yeah.
tales adapted in this way.
And I think that's really only happened in the last well, certainly in the last 200 years. You know, before that, I don't think anybody had thought of these stories as stories for children at all.
And you're saying also that you're thinking about different voices. So we're hearing multiple versions of tales. You have collected sort of single versions, but then in your notes, you're talking about there are other versions of this available with a different kind of a voice from a different region.
Yeah. I think it's very important for people to not to feel that there is a fixed text of a folk tale or a definitive version of a folk tale, because each version, as it's told, is changed by who's telling it, who they're telling it to, the circumstances of telling. You know, everything alters the story. I wanted in this book to give absolutely authentic texts, in that I was reproducing exactly as I found them, the folk tales in good versions. But I didn't want to suggest these are the only versions, or this is the only way of telling the tale. I mean, partly I wanted the book, and still want it, to be a kind of source book for storytellers, for poets, for novelists. I mean, that's why I particularly like it that someone like Neil Gaiman would take the version of Snow White in that book and turn it into Snow Glass Apples, for instance, which is a wonderful book. And it's not a retelling of the Snow White in here, but it's a recasting of it, or a reimagining.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's it, that he writes for a contemporary audience, but he's taking something from a long tradition. And like you say, recasting it. I like this idea of there not being a definitive version, because these stories often come from an oral storytelling tradition.
Yeah.
Is that how you could see? Do you hear these stories? Do you listen to them in your mind when you're selecting them?
Well, when I was making the selection, because I mean this book's almost the same in terms of selection as the original edition. I was definitely wanting ones that worked with a feeling of an oral tale, but also ones that worked on the page. And that's quite difficult actually with some of the ones that are transliterated into very heavy dialect, and one had to make a decision. Does one keep this, you know, thicket of wrongly spelled words, or does one alter it? And I decided to keep everything exactly as I found it. But it does mean that some of the stories, I mean, like the ones collected in the Lincolnshire Fens by Marie Clotilde Balfour, it's actually easier to read them aloud than it is reading them on the page, because you get the rhythm of them, and you get the understanding that the importance of dialect in the tellings is to do with the grammar and the very specific dialect words, rather than putting on an accent. And you know, so certainly with those, it's easier to work out exactly what's going on when you read them aloud than it is when you just read it on the page.
So I wonder if your background as a poet is actually key in that selection of hearing the words loud.
Well, certainly, I mean, I suppose it's something that I have always done with literature generally. I mean, I like reading poetry aloud. I like reading stories aloud. I like being read to as well. So in terms of that, I feel things like rhythm and color in a text are as important as simply the wording of them. And I mean, because actually I wasn't writing poetry really in those days, or if I was writing very bad poetry. So, um,
Okay, so what do you think it is then about the English folk tale that fascinates us so much? So many of us feel compelled to return to them again and again, and you're saying that just at this moment in time, you've hit the zeitgeist, you've got your finger on the pulse somehow. What is it that keeps drawing us back?
Well, I think it's to do with somehow recognizing a deep recognition of the voices that we find in a book like this one, that they've got an authenticity to them. They feel like they stem from a real living culture and express a real living culture. And it's not as if the stories that we find in England are all that different from the stories that you find in, you know, pretty well every other country, certainly in the Indo-European tradition. The same basic plot types recur again and again and again everywhere you look. But there's a certain element of the Englishness of these stories, which is not to do with plot. It's to do with the way they're told and the way they feel in the mouth. And there's a certain sort of essential Englishness to them. I mean, in the slightly laconic way in which many of them are told, and in the informality of the English tradition. I mean, quite a lot of storytelling traditions are really quite formal. There are set rules about who's allowed to tell stories, when they're allowed to tell them. People will gather specifically for storytelling sessions and sit and listen to the local storyteller. And the English tradition, as far as I can see, was never really like that. It was much more informal. People just told stories as and when. And therefore, you tend to get shorter stories. You tend not to get as many of the long wonder tales that we are familiar with from people like Grimm. You get an awful lot of local legends and stories about ghosts and mermaids and witches and things like that. A lot of comic tales, which are really just told to make you laugh. You find the same tales again and again. Often, you know, it's a bit like the modern urban legends. You know, things that happen to a friend of a friend. I mean, you're endlessly being told the same story by people who claim it happened to the friend of their friend. And a lot of these stories are rather similar, really. I mean, I just made a note just before we talked about a story that I quoted in the introduction to the book. So, a Wiltshire man at the end of the 19th century, he says, "I've heard 'em say as Adam were made and then put up again a old earl to dry." And I mean, that's it. That's the whole story. But it's brilliant. I mean, it's a little piece of English mythology.
It's almost like flash fiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
which we're
Yeah.
it's quite common today. I mean, one of the things I notice very much in so many of the tales is that they don't have the sort of structure that we're now used to, which you've just mentioned. We don't have the long tail or the moral being lathered on thickly for us to understand what the point of the tale was. It just is the tale.
Yeah, I mean, the addition of morals to tales is not really very common. I mean, the big folktale collection that does have morals is Perrault's in France. But that, that's quite a literary approach to retelling the stories. And it's a sort of sophisticated literary ironic take in his rhymed morals. But I mean, an English tale will just end saying, and then I went away or something like that. And that's it. Though you do get these lovely formulae at the beginning and at the end of tales, which, I really like. And I mean, even sometimes they're quite truncated, but they've got a sort of, they locate the story outside time. I mean, there's a very good example, if I can find this, Clever Jack, which is a version of the Master Thief story, which you find all over the place. And this was collected by Henry Mayhew, who wrote London Labour and the London Poor, as an example of the kind of stories that they told in the casual wards of London workhouses in the 1860s. And this is told by a 16-year-old boy. And it starts, "You see, mates, there was once upon a time, and a very good time it was, a young man, and he runned away and got along with a gang of thieves." And, you're in the story pretty immediately, but you've been ushered into it with this formula of once upon a time and a very good time it was.
Yeah.
And there are some really elaborate beginnings. I mean, the version of Jack the Giant Killer in here has got, 3 or 4 paragraphs of opening formulae before you get to the story itself. Then you get the story itself. And then you get, at the close, a little closing formula, which is, "Bebo bend it, my story's ended. If you don't like it, you may mend it." And there's loads of these things.
You can just
which I
imagine it, can't
really
you?
enjoy.
The way in which the audiences or the listeners would have really understood that kind of coding, I suppose, of that they're being cued in their responses to the tale itself, with the ending that way. They know that it's time for them to clap and cheer, and then wait for the next story.
Yeah, exactly.
And such a sort of a melodic feel to it as well. The way that you've read out that story there, you can hear that melody in the written word, which works so well as a spoken word.
Yes.
So not surprisingly, I would say there's some sensibilities that are a little less palatable today, that crop up in some of the stories. I'm thinking of the humpbacked ugly sisters as loathsome characters, and that sort of example. But do we dismiss those? How do we respond to these kinds of characters and stories in the 21st century?
I think we just have to accept them as to some extent stereotypical figures that reflect the time in which they were told. And I think in the folktale generally, there's not much in the way of character in folk tales. The characters are fairly one-dimensional, and the nature of the character is defined often by these descriptive characteristics of beauty or ugliness or whatever. I mean, there are folk tales that turn that the other way around, so that you get a story like The Frog Lover, where the the good character is this sort of rather loathsome, slimy frog, and the bad character is this sort of lovely girl. So, you know, they're not all completely stereotypical. But yes, I mean, the thing that I have the most trouble with in fairy tales is this stereotype of the wicked stepmother, which I think is very damaging, and you don't find very much actually in English tales. And if you look at the Grimm's tales, very often the first version they noted down, or the first version they published, it's a mother, and then they changed these mothers to being stepmothers. I mean, not in every case, but in some cases, as a way of sort of not offending the mothers of Germany, basically.
Yeah.
Whereas, I mean, if you look at, for instance, English versions of the tale type, "My mother slew me, my father ate me," which we know best probably from the Grimm's Juniper Tree, in which it's a wicked stepmother who kills the son of the new husband by his previous marriage, and then bakes him into a pie, and then the bones get buried, and the tree, does a tree grow up? I can't remember now in Juniper Tree. But anyway, he turns into a bird, and the bird's song then reveals the dastardly plot that's happened. And in that Grimm tale, he gets transformed back into a child again at the end. Now, that's one of the commonest stories you find in England. And I don't know that there are any versions in which the child is actually transformed back. They're killed and turned into a bird, and that's that.
Yeah.
I mean, the one in this book is the rose tree. And the bird sings this mournful little song. "My wicked mother slew me. My dear father ate me. My little brother whom I love sits below, and I sing above. Stick, stock, stone, dead."
And there it ends.
That's it. Well, I mean, the retribution is wreaked on the mother, which it always is in these tales, but there's no happy ending, and it is actually a mother. I mean, there's another one I quote in the notes where there's not even any transformation. It's just, the mother kills the daughter and serves her up in a pie.
Genuinely grim.
Yeah, it's a really gruesome tale, and there's a real appetite for the frightening and macabre, the grisly and the gruesome, much more so, I think, than there is for the tales of wonder and transformation. Whether that's always been the case, or whether we've just lost a lot of those wonder tales. I mean, I think a lot were lost by the wayside in, first of all, the great upheaval of the Industrial Revolution. And if you think of people telling stories to each other, if you go and work in a cotton mill, you're not going to be telling stories because it's absolutely deafening.
Yeah.
I mean, literally deafening. They all went deaf. So there isn't the space for those stories to survive in. And there's also this fairly early development of pretty well universal literacy in England. And although that's a good thing, literacy is sort of the enemy of the folktale, really, because it takes away the need to remember the stories, and it also introduces the kind of cheap retellings that soon began circulating in the 19th century of fairy tales in chapbook form, these little books that were sold by peddlers. And these were often based on Perrault, for instance. So, I mean, it's interesting in the poem, long poem, The Shepherd's Calendar by John Clare. John Clare was known as the peasant poet, and he came from an unlettered background. His father had a great stock of songs and of stories. Clare could read, and the version of Cinderella that he tells is a mixture of, you can tell, of a chapbook retelling of Perrault's version, because it's got the rat coachman and the fairy godmother that she's just described as a fairy. But it's a mixture of that with obviously a local version, which probably his father told him, in which it's a golden glove that Cinderella loses at the ball. It's not a glass slipper. And so you get there an interesting mix of inherited and learned tale within the same story.
And so you mentioned the Cinderella story. Obviously, you've published another book on the Cinderella story, I believe, back in the 80s. Is that right?
Yes, that was.
If I remember, is it Kappa Rushes is one of the stories that you have in the collection. That's the story that incorporates a daughter who is proving her love to her father with that idiom, I love you as fresh meat loves salt.
Yes.
Which is not necessarily part of the Cinderella story that a lot of people will be familiar with. Clearly this has stood the test of time, but it's got lots of different versions there. Not only written, published versions, but film and television as well. So this is an example of another tale that we keep being drawn back to. What is it about Cinderella?
I think the crucial thing about the Cinderella stories, and that this goes through all the different types of Cinderella story, because there are a few distinct types as well as the Cinderella story we all know. I think the crucial meaning of it is about that you can't extinguish a mother's love. I think that is the absolute bedrock of the Cinderella story. Because whether the dead mother comes back as a fairy godmother or as a talking fish or a cow or a gift-giving tree or sometimes several of these things, it's this: the mother's love is always there to look after the Cinderella figure and get her out of her terrible situation in the end and make everything come right. And I think people think of it as a romantic story about, the girl meeting her prince and things. It's got that element to it, but I think the crucial thing is it's the mother's love that saves her.
That kind of balances out, doesn't it, what you were saying about the treatment of the stepmother. Clearly there is this veneration of the mother figure that comes through as a strong trend.
Yes. Whereas in a lot of Cinderella stories, the mother dies in childbirth and the father promises he won't marry anyone who isn't as beautiful as the mother. And then the only person who's as beautiful as the mother is the daughter. And so there's this incestuous theme that runs through a lot of them, where the father is certainly not behaving in a way that you would want. And equally in that sort of King Lear lover's salt variants, you get this father who's just completely unreasonable, and it has to be proved to him at his daughter when he's present, not realizing it's his daughter getting married at the wedding feast, and she serves up all the food without any salt. And he says, "This is awful. This wedding feast is the worst meal I've ever had." And then she brings out another lot of dishes with salt in, and he realizes the terrible mistake he's made.
And then we have the tears and the repentance. You placed into your introduction a strong appreciation for what you called the rewilding of the English folk tale, and I thought that was a really fascinating expression, talking about recent and contemporary storytellers at this point in time taking tales, I think you were saying, out of the hands of the academic world and back into the hands of those who kind of peddle stories as their profession. So
Yeah.
what can you explain to us what you mean by this rewilding of the English folktale?
Well, I think because people, when I published this book 30 years ago, the first edition, I think people would have generally have said, well, the English folk tale's a dead tradition. And since then, it's sort of gone from strength to strength. You've got these large numbers of oral storytellers who've been really inspired by that first generation of new oral storytellers, people like Ben Haggerty and Hugh Lupton and Pom Clayton. And now there's loads of them going around telling stories and making them their own. And I think that's absolutely great. And you've also got people approaching folklore from a completely different angle. So you've got the enchantment. And I think both of those are very profound statements. So I get this feeling that people are reclaiming these stories and this folklore for themselves, for their own purposes. And this is what people have done throughout history. You find people like Shakespeare making quite a lot of use of English folklore and folk tales. He tends to do it in a fairly oblique kind of way, because he just quotes a bit of a tale and he just expects his audience to all know it, which of course nowadays it has to be explained in a footnote. But
that's useful, thank you. So we can't really have a complete discussion about English folktales really without some mention of Alan Garner. You do credit Alan Garner with significant influence on your work. I believe he was the subject of your PhD. Am I right?
Well, one chapter of my PhD was about Alan Garner,
right.
And I expanded that into my first book, A Fine Anger.
Right.
I'm working on a new edition of now, actually.
Oh, excellent.
Vastly expanded again, because it's got to take in all the books he's written since.
Of course,
in 1981
yes.
it came out, I think.
Well, there's one that's just come out, isn't there? Treacle Walker has come out this year.
Yeah, which is a marvelous book. I mean, it's so short and yet so complex. It's a really many layered book, and full of this wonderful linguistic bravura and thematic bravura. I mean, he mixes in all these things like the Grail quest. A question that's obsessed him all his life is, why does the hero in the Sleeping King stories, why must the hero not wake the Sleeping King? And all these things are there in Treacle Walker, alongside a children's comic coming to life. And this weird thing, the anomaly at the heart of the book is that you have this child living seemingly on his own in the middle of nowhere. And it's not at all clear whether the child's supposed to be alive or dead. And at the end, the child asks the other main character, Treacle Walker, the rag and bone man, am I dead? And Treacle Walker says something like, I would rather say, in this world you have changed your life and gone into another place.
Goodness.
Got into another place, which is pretty well word for word what Mallory says about King Arthur. So, it's one of these books of incredible depth and resonance. But, it's just been a contender for the Booker Prize, which I was really thrilled to hear. And I hope that will bring Garner's books to a whole new audience. I mean, he's been a bit pigeonholed as a children's writer, which was never wholly true, even at the beginning, and hasn't really been true for the last 40 years. So, and the adult novels he's published have been really complex works. I mean, the children's books are complex too. I mean, in some ways, the book of his I like best is the Stone Book Quartet, which is the one with the most a sort of crystalline clarity on the surface, and yet these unfathomable depths below. And I think that is the book. So it's 4 little interlinked novellas, in which he really never puts a foot wrong at all. But he's one of our finest writers,
Absolutely.
the post-war era, and that's why I dedicated this book to him, because he's someone who really understands the folk tale, and in particular the English folk tale.
Absolutely. Yeah, I believe that he's actually said that for some reason that he doesn't quite understand, it seems that children connect with his stories better than adults do. So perhaps there's some kind of acceptance that children have of a tale that adults can't work their way through. They're too critical, perhaps too analytical to actually accept it.
I certainly think there's always this element of uncertainty in Garner. You know, almost everything can mean 2 or 3 or 4 different things depending on what angle you look at it from. And I think a lot of adults want an absolute straightforward certainty in a story. They don't want to be given almost a cubist story in which you can see eyes on the side of the face as well as the front.
Yeah.
And so to that extent, I think a mind which is less set in its ways is going to find Alan Garner's work easier to respond to, because they haven't got the same expectations of a particular kind of storytelling.
Absolutely. And I want to actually note some of the very same people who call themselves fans of Garner, so we've got people like Neil Gaiman, Philip Pullman, they're the very same people who are offering praise for this book that is that's come out.
I mean, I think there is a big overlap between the kind of people who really respond to folk tales and the kind of people who really respond to Garner as a writer, or indeed to Gaiman or to Pullman, because it's a love of, I don't really want to say the fantastic, but the beyond reality, the sense of numinousness, of there being another world, but behind a thin veil that we can reach if we just reach out with our imaginations. And I think that's really what folk tales give us, is access to this other world. I mean, in stories about actual fairies, it is absolutely acted out that the protagonist goes into another world entirely. And in the fairy tale of Cherry of Zennor, for instance, Cherry meets a gentleman on the moors and he offers her a job, and she takes this job as a nursemaid to his child. His mother has died. And just like the boy in Treacle Walker, she rubs a magic ointment on her eye and it just obtains the glamoury, and she can see that she's actually living with fairies.
Yes.
In another world. But when she reveals that she can see them, even though she and her fairy master have fallen in love, she's cast out, never to come back again, and basically dies of a broken heart. So you get all these stories about human beings being able to enter another world and beings from other worlds being able to enter our world. It's a permeable membrane. Yeah, it's an interesting topic.
Absolutely, and I think that's what a lot of us are drawn to, is wanting to move beyond that veil and see what we can find there. And many of these tales enable us to do that in your collection. I've just got one more question for you, Neil, which is a comment that you make on your website. Actually, you say this statement: there is still a lot more to write. Now, for any fan of your work, of course, that's music to our ears. But what is there still to write for you?
Well, I'm working at the moment on a vastly overambitious book about what myth is, what it means, and why it matters, which is sort of taking in the whole of every human society and culture since like the Ice Age to now, and which is taking me forever to write because every sentence seems to require me to read another 5 books before I think, well, I can't make that any better. But when I've got to the end of that book, which is called at the moment The Hidden Matrix, I've got an equally big book on the fairy tale and stories and storytelling.
Great.
In the works, a lot of which is actually already written because it's basically going to be a collection of essays and lectures and things that I've given over the years, with a few new bits and pieces here and there. I've got a new and selected poems ready to go. And I've got quite a lot of ideas for fiction. I mean, I've only really published one novel, A Tale of Sir Gawain, right at the beginning of my career, which has just been translated into Japanese, which I'm rather thrilled about. But I've got quite a lot of ideas for novels. So, I mean, I'd like to see if I can actually get to the end of one rather than just writing the first few chapters and giving up, which has been has happened in my past. And I've got various other ideas for sort of folklore kinds of books. It a bit depends, really. I mean, I'm hoping as this book has done, it looks as if it's going to do very well, that I'll be able to pitch a few ideas to Watkins and they'll pick one they want to run with and we can go from there.
That would be amazing. And without wishing time away, I can't wait to see some of those books available. That's going to be wonderful. And I think I know what to put on my Christmas list for next year. So thank you so much, Neil, for joining us to talk about the Watkins Book of English Folk Tales. It's been an absolute joy and a privilege. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jenny. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. So if I stop recording at this point.